Welcome to Conspiracist.
Glad to be here.
We've got some really interesting materials today, looking into a pretty persistent hypothesis.
Yes, the idea that governments have been actively, intentionally hiding evidence about Freemason power networks.
Exactly. And our aim for this deep dive is to really unpack that claim, look at the evidence, the reasoning presented in these sources, and do it professionally, objectively.
Sounds good. The materials cover quite a bit the history of Freemasonry, opposition to it, the whole concept of secret societies. It gives us a lot to work with.
Definitely. So maybe we should start by just establishing what Freemasonry is, according to these sources.
Sure. They describe it primarily as a civic-minded fraternity. Brotherhood, mutual support.
And there's a core requirement, right? Belief in a supreme being.
Yes, that's key. Often termed the grand architect of the universe. Membership, generally for adult men who ask to join, hinges on that belief.
The sources also mention DMLA for younger men with a similar spiritual requirement.
That's right. And crucially, the sources highlight the rituals.
Which are kept secret.
Precisely. They aren't public knowledge. And it's this secrecy, as the materials point out, that kind of, opens the door to speculation.
It makes sense. Secrecy often does. The sources also link this to the broader idea of secret societies.
Yeah, they mention secrecy and selective membership as defining traits. Some definitions even include the idea that members might favor each other.
And there's a distinction made, too, about elite secret societies, people with wealth or social influence.
Exactly. It's a subcategory discussed in the materials. All of this sets the stage for why people might suspect hidden influence.
Which brings us neatly to the historical context. These sources detail a long and sometimes quite intense history of suspicions surrounding Freemasons.
Oh, definitely. Accusations of plotting world domination, even claims they were behind revolutions. It's all in there.
One major example the sources focus on is the Catholic Church's stance.
A very long history of condemnation, yeah. Concerns over the temples, the secret rituals. The sources mention some extremely strong language used against them at certain points. Synagogue of Satan, I believe, was one term cited.
Wow. And this wasn't just religious opposition. In early America, there was significant political distrust, too.
Right, leading to the anti-Masonic Party. Around 1828, the sources say, America's first third party, interestingly enough.
What fueled that, according to the materials?
A lot of it was that many prominent political figures were Masons. So the idea that this secret society might be pulling strings behind the scenes, it seemed plausible to many people.
Plausible enough to form a whole political party.
Absolutely. And it had real effects. The sources mention Masonic societies actually closing down. Some churches even threatened their members leave the Masons or face expulsion.
It must have been quite a movement. Didn't John Quincy Adams get involved?
He did. The sources know he publicly stated he wasn't a Mason and even joined the anti-Masonic Party for a time. It shows how mainstream these concerns became.
It's fascinating how these materials suggest that the anti-Masonic sentiment sort of paved the way for other conspiracy theories.
Yeah, about groups seen as outsiders, like Catholics or Mormons, supposedly manipulating the government for elite interests. It points to a recurring anxiety in society, maybe, about hidden control.
And this opposition wasn't just a Western thing, was it? The sources mention situations in other parts of the world.
That's a crucial point raised in the materials. There's been opposition, even bans, in some predominantly Muslim countries.
Like Pakistan.
Yes, Pakistan in 1972, Freemasonry banned, lodge buildings confiscated, and then there's the extreme example from Iraq under Saddam Hussein.
What happened there?
Masonic lodges were forced to close earlier, but under Saddam, the sources state that promoting Freemasonry was actually punishable by death. It was labeled a Zionist principle.
Goodness, that really underscores the global reach of these suspicions and the severity of the reactions in some places.
It does. It highlights that concerns about secrecy and potential influence aren't confined to one culture or political system. Different contexts, different reasons, but the suspicion is there.
So let's talk about the image of Freemasonry. The sources present a kind of duality, don't they?
Very much so. On one hand, you have the Freemasons' own portrayal, a civic charitable group, doing good works, harmless rituals. Think of the Shriners and their hospitals often highlighted.
A very positive, community-focused image.
Right. But then you have the conspiracy theories described in the sources.
Which paint a drastically different picture.
Completely different. A secret, incredibly powerful organization, aiming for world domination, global control. That's the narrative.
And these theories often weave Freemasonry into, like, larger networks.
Yes, the sources detail connections being made to the Knights Templar, the Illuminati, this idea of a new world order. It becomes part of a bigger tapestry of alleged secret control.
What are the supposed motivations behind these alleged conspiracies, according to the materials?
They vary. Sometimes religious, sometimes occult, or even satanic, other times purely political power. It's a mix.
And the sources point out how long some of these ideas stick around, the Knights Templar example.
Right. Dissolved centuries ago, yet still central to conspiracy theories 900 years later, as the sources mention, it shows the longevity of these narratives.
Okay, let's shift to the core question. The evidence for intentional concealment by governments of these supposed power networks. What do the sources offer here?
Well, they acknowledge the historical facts. Many Freemasons have been in positions of power. That's undeniable.
Figures like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington. The sources mention them being Masons during the founding era of the U.S.
Exactly, and that's often used as circumstantial evidence. Look, they were Masons, they were in charge, therefore influence.
But influence isn't necessarily a secret controlling network, right? And it's certainly not proof of government concealment.
Precisely. The sources are careful, implicitly suggesting that correlation isn't causation. Just because powerful people were Masons doesn't automatically mean a secret network was controlling things, or that governments actively hid it.
The secrecy aspect seems key again.
It really is. As we discuss, the secret rituals, the membership practices, they naturally create suspicion. They provide fertile ground for these kinds of theories to grow, as the materials imply.
The sources also touch on how Freemasonry itself changed over time.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Evolving from actual guilds of stonemasons into more like social clubs for elite white men in the 18th century.
And that shift could suggest a different kind of potential influence, maybe within certain social circles.
It could, within those specific strata. And going back to the anti-Masonic party, the sources describe how they use national conventions, party newspapers. It shows these concerns about Masonic influence weren't just whispers, they became major political issues.
But what about more recently? Do the sources offer anything there?
They mention the decline in Masonic membership in the U.S. since its peak around 1957. That's a significant drop.
Which might suggest less overall influence today.
Possibly less widespread influence, but, it doesn't completely rule out localized networks or influence operating in less visible ways. The sources don't really provide evidence either way on that modern aspect definitively.
And Freemasonry still exists globally, despite all the opposition.
It does. That resilience, surviving bans and persecution, as detailed in the materials, is notable. It indicates, well, perhaps some form of ongoing influence, though whether it's a deliberately concealed power network is the big question.
Is there any specific instance cited in the materials where a Masonic group did engage in something like political maneuvering?
There is one example discussed, the Affair of the Cards in France.
What was that about?
It involved the Grand Orient of France, a major Masonic body there, gathering information, essentially intelligence, on the religious and political views of army officers in the early 20th century.
So that's a documented case of a Masonic group involved in political intelligence.
Yes, it is. But, as the sources would imply, it's one specific historical event in one country. Does it prove a vast, ongoing, globally concealed power network actively hidden by governments worldwide?
Probably not on its own. It shows potential for political involvement, but doesn't confirm the grand conspiracy theory.
Exactly. When you look objectively at the information presented in these sources, the historical suspicions, the real opposition, the inherent nature of secrecy, it builds a picture of why these theories exist. But the concrete proof for intentional, widespread governmental concealment of a controlling network, it just doesn't seem to be there in these materials.
So to sort of wrap up, we've explored this hypothesis based on the sources provided. We've seen the historical context, the opposition, the fact that Masons have been influential. That all provides fertile ground.
It absolutely does. It explains the origins and persistence of these ideas.
But based on our review of these specific materials, the actual evidence for governments intentionally concealing a pervasive, controlling Freemason power network still seems to fall into the category of hypothesis, not established fact.
I'd agree with that assessment based on the sources. The materials highlight anxieties, historical events, and the effects of secrecy, but they don't present conclusive evidence for that specific claim of deliberate governmental cover-up on a grand scale.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.